The night sky over Montana Territory split open with streaks of silver fire, and Cassandra Montgomery stood frozen in the dusty street of Stillwater, watching her entire world change in a single breath. It was August 1882, and the town had been buzzing for weeks about the meteor shower that astronomers predicted would light up the heavens. Cassandra had arrived in Stillwater only 3 months prior, a mail-order bride who had traveled all the way from Boston to marry a rancher named Herbert Gaines. But Herbert had died of pneumonia 2 weeks before her train pulled into the station, leaving her stranded in a territory she did not know, with no money to return home, and no family waiting for her if she did. She had taken work at the general store, sleeping in a small room above the shop, trying to figure out what her life would become now that all her careful plans had crumbled to dust. The meteor shower had brought nearly everyone in town out into the streets. Families spread blankets in front of their homes, children pointed at the sky with excited shouts, and men passed bottles of whiskey between them as they tilted their heads back to watch the celestial display. Cassandra stood alone near the wooden steps of the general store, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm summer night. She had never seen anything so beautiful, so overwhelming. The meteors streaked across the darkness like tears of light, and she found herself thinking about wishes, about hope, about all the things she had given up believing in. That was when she noticed him watching her from across the street. He was leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, a tall man with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore dusty trousers, scuffed boots, and a worn shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. A cowboy hat sat low on his head, shadowing his face, but she could see his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. When their gazes met, he did not look away. Instead, he straightened slowly, took off his hat, and nodded to her with a small, almost shy smile. Cassandra felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly turned her attention back to the sky. She told herself she was being foolish, that a man looking at her meant nothing in a town where eligible women were scarce. But her heart hammered in her chest, and she could not resist glancing back across the street. He was still watching her, and this time he raised his hand in a small wave. She hesitated, then lifted her own hand in response before hurrying up the stairs to her room, her pulse racing. What she did not know was that the cowboy, whose name was James Dalton, had been watching her for weeks. He worked at the Triple R Ranch outside of town, breaking horses and managing cattle drives, and he came into Stillwater every Saturday to pick up supplies. The first time he had seen Cassandra behind the counter at the general store, carefully measuring out flour for old Mrs. Henderson, he had felt something shift in his chest. She had looked up at him with eyes the color of new grass, and her shy smile had knocked the breath right out of him. James was 26 years old, and he had spent most of his adult life on horseback, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He had grown up in Texas, the youngest son of a farmer who had lost everything to drought and debt. At 16, James had headed north, looking for work and a fresh start. He had found both in Montana, and for the past 5 years he had been saving every penny he could, dreaming of buying his own piece of land someday. He had never thought much about marriage or family. The life of a cowboy was hard and lonely, and he had accepted that as his lot. But then he had seen Cassandra, and everything had changed. He had learned her story from the town gossips, how she had come all this way to marry a man she had never met, only to find herself alone and adrift. His heart had ached for her, and he had found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering if she was lonely, if she was scared, if she ever smiled when she was alone. He had wanted to talk to her to introduce himself properly, but he was just a ranch hand with calloused hands and dusty clothes, and she was a lady from Boston with refined manners and a gentle voice. What could he possibly offer her? But tonight, standing under the meteor shower with the whole sky on fire above them, James had made a wish. He had closed his eyes, picked out the brightest streak of light, and whispered into the darkness, asking for something he had never dared to want before. He wished for Cassandra Montgomery, He wished that somehow, against all odds and reason, she might come to care for him the way he was already beginning to care for her. It was a foolish wish, a cowboy's dream. But as he opened his eyes and saw her still standing across the street, bathed in starlight, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, miracles could happen. Cassandra, for her part, had made her own wish that night. Standing alone on the steps watching the meteors fall, she had wished for a second chance. She had wished for love, real love, not the practical arrangement she had been traveling toward when she left Boston. She had wished for someone who would see her, truly see her, and choose her anyway. She had not thought of the cowboy across the street when she made her wish, but later, lying in her narrow bed, she found herself remembering his smile and the way his eyes had held hers, and she wondered if perhaps the universe had already begun to answer. The next morning was a Sunday, and Cassandra walked to the small church at the edge of town for services. The church was a simple wooden building with rough-hewn pews and a cross carved by hand, but the congregation was warm and welcoming. She had been attending since her arrival, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of hymns and prayers, even as everything else in her life felt uncertain. She settled into her usual spot near the back, smoothing her skirt and opening her hymnal, and then she felt someone slide into the pew beside her. It was him, the cowboy from last night. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep brown, warm and kind, and that he had shaved that morning, though he had missed a small spot along his jaw. He smelled like soap and leather and something else, something clean and masculine that made her pulse quicken. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and when he looked at her, his smile was hesitant. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. "I hope you do not mind me sitting here. I am James Dalton." "Cassandra," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cassandra Montgomery. I know who you are. You come into the store." "I do," he agreed, and his smile widened just a fraction. "You always remember what I need before I even ask for it. You are good at your job." "Thank you," she said, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She wanted to say more, to ask him why he had crossed the street to sit beside her, but the Reverend had begun to speak, and they both turned their attention to the front of the church. Except Cassandra could not focus on a single word of the sermon. She was too aware of James beside her, the heat of his body so close to hers, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against her own. When they stood to sing, his voice was deep and slightly off-key, and she found it charming. When they sat again, his knee bumped hers, and he murmured an apology that made her smile. By the time the service ended, she felt as though every nerve in her body was singing. As the congregation filed out into the bright morning sunshine, James touched her elbow gently. "Miss Montgomery," he said, "would you allow me to walk you back to the store? I know it is not far, but I would appreciate the company." Cassandra knew she should be cautious, that she barely knew this man, but something in his eyes made her feel safe. She nodded, and they set off together down the dusty main street of Stillwater. They walked slowly, and James asked her about Boston, about her journey west, about how she was finding life in Montana. Cassandra found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone else, about how overwhelming it had been to arrive and find Herbert dead, about how she had cried for 3 days straight, not because she had loved him, for they had never met, but because she felt so utterly lost. James listened without interrupting, his expression serious and thoughtful, and when she finished, he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. You deserved better than that." His words, simple and sincere, brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. They reached the general store too quickly, and Cassandra found herself reluctant for the conversation to end. James seemed to feel the same way because he lingered on the bottom step, turning his hat in his hands again. "Miss Montgomery," he said, "I was wondering if you might like to go for a ride sometime. I know a place just outside of town where the wildflowers are blooming, and there is a creek that runs clear and cold. It is peaceful there. I think you might like it." Cassandra's heart leaped. "I would like that very much," she said. James's face lit up with a grin that transformed him from handsome to absolutely breathtaking. How about next Saturday afternoon? I could borrow a wagon from the ranch, make it comfortable for you. Saturday would be perfect, she agreed. He put his hat back on, tipped it to her, and said, "Until Saturday then, Miss Montgomery." "Until Saturday, Mr. Dalton," she replied, and she watched him walk away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst right out of her chest. The week that followed was the longest of Cassandra's life. She went through her days at the store in a daze, measuring out sugar and beans and fabric while her mind wandered to Saturday. She found herself daydreaming about James, about his smile, about the way his voice had sounded when he said her name. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was being foolish to hope, to believe that something good might finally be happening to her. James, meanwhile, was practically useless at the ranch. He daydreamed through his chores, nearly got kicked by a horse he was supposed to be training, and rode out to check fences, only to realize an hour later that he had forgotten to bring any tools. His boss, a gruff man named Samuel Reed, finally cornered him in the barn on Thursday evening and said, "Dalton, what the hell is wrong with you? You've been walking around here with your head in the clouds all week." James ducked his head, embarrassed. "Sorry, boss. I have just got a lot on my mind." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then his weathered face softened into something that might have been a smile. "This got something to do with that pretty girl from the general store? I heard you walked her home from church on Sunday." News traveled fast in a small town. James felt his ears go red. "Maybe," he admitted. Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "About time you settled down, Dalton. You're a good man and you deserve some happiness. Just do me a favor and keep your mind on your work until after Saturday, all right?" "Yes, sir," James said, grinning. Saturday finally arrived, and James woke before dawn, too excited to sleep. He washed thoroughly, put on his cleanest shirt and trousers, and even borrowed a Little Bay rum cologne from one of the other ranch hands. He hitched up a wagon, lining the bed with blankets and pillows to make it comfortable, and packed a basket with bread, cheese, cold chicken, apples, and a jar of lemonade that the ranch cook had helped him prepare. By the time he drove into town, his heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Cassandra was waiting on the steps of the general store wearing a pale blue dress that made her eyes look even more green. Her hair was pinned up neatly, with a few soft curls framing her face, and she held a small parasol to shield herself from the sun. When she saw him, her face broke into a radiant smile that made every anxious moment of the past week worth it. "Good afternoon, Miss Montgomery," James said, hopping down from the wagon and offering her his hand. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dalton," she replied, placing her hand in his. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle as he helped her up into the wagon seat. They set off out of town, the wagon rattling over the rutted road, and for a few minutes they rode in comfortable silence. The day was warm and clear, with a breeze that carried the scent of sage and grass. In the distance, the mountains rose up against the sky, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "You were right," Cassandra said after a while. "It is beautiful out here." "Wait until you see the meadow," James said. "It is just up ahead." Up. He turned the wagon off the main road and onto a narrow track that wound through stands of cottonwood trees. After about 15 minutes, they emerged into a wide meadow that was carpeted with wildflowers in every color imaginable: bright yellow, deep purple, soft pink, and brilliant red. A creek ran along one edge of the meadow, its water sparkling in the sunlight, and the whole place felt like something out of a dream. "Oh," Cassandra breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "James, this is incredible." He pulled the wagon to a stop under the shade of a large tree and helped her down. They spread out the blankets near the creek, and James unpacked the basket while Cassandra walked to the water's edge, watching the sunlight dance on the surface. She knelt down and dipped her fingers in, laughing at how cold it was. "It comes straight down from the mountains," James explained, joining her by the water, fed by snow melt. "Best water you will ever taste." She cupped her hands and took a sip, then smiled up at him. "You're right. It is delicious. They settled on the blankets and ate their picnic lunch, talking and laughing as though they had known each other for years instead of days. James told her about growing up in Texas, about leaving home so young, about the ranches he had worked and the places he had seen. Cassandra told him about Boston, about her strict upbringing, about how she had answered Herbert's advertisement because she had wanted adventure and independence, even if it meant marrying a stranger. "Do you regret coming here?" James asked quietly. Cassandra considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It has been hard, and I have been scared, but I do not regret it. If I had stayed in Boston, I would have married someone my father chose for me, someone respectable and dull. I would have spent my whole life wondering what else was out there. At least here, I have a chance to find out." James looked at her with such warmth in his eyes that she felt her breath catch. "You are braver than you give yourself credit for," he said. "Coming all this way on your own, starting over after everything fell apart, that takes real courage." No one had ever called her brave before. Cassandra felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the meadow, walking along the creek, picking wildflowers, and simply enjoying each other's company. James showed her how to skip stones across the water, and Cassandra laughed so hard when his first attempt sank immediately that he pretended to be offended, which only made her laugh harder. When she finally managed to skip a stone twice, she turned to him with such a triumphant expression that he could not help but pull her into a quick, impulsive hug. The moment his arms closed around her, everything changed. Cassandra went very still, and James realized what he had done. He started to pull back, to apologize, but she looked up at him with those green eyes, and the words died in his throat. She was so close he could see the flecks of gold in her irises, could feel the warmth of her breath against his skin. His hand came up almost of its own accord, cupping her cheek gently, and when she did not pull away, he lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to stop him. She did not stop him. Instead, she rose up on her toes and met him halfway. Their first kiss was soft and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. James felt his heart explode in his chest, felt the world narrow down to just the two of them, to the warmth of her lips against his and the way her hands clutched at his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I have been wanting to do that since the night of the meteor shower, so have I," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. They kissed again, slower this time, deeper, and when they finally pulled apart, James knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with this woman. It was too soon, too fast, but he could not deny what he felt. She was everything he had never known he wanted, and he would do whatever it took to make her happy. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the meadow, they reluctantly packed up the wagon and headed back to town. James drove with one hand on the reins and the other holding Cassandra's, their fingers intertwined. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the promise of everything that lay ahead. When they reached the general store, James walked her to the door, reluctant to say goodbye. "Miss Montgomery," he began, then shook his head. "Cassandra, may I see you again? Soon?" "I would like that," she said, smiling up at him. "Very much. How about tomorrow? After church, we could have lunch together. Tomorrow sounds perfect." He kissed her hand, his lips warm against her knuckles, and then watched as she disappeared into the store. As he drove the wagon back to the ranch, James found himself grinning like a fool, replaying every moment of the day in his mind. The next weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing affection. James and Cassandra saw each other every chance they could, and the whole town began to take notice. People smiled when they saw them walking together, and more than one person told Cassandra how lucky she was to have caught the attention of James Dalton, who was known as one of the hardest working and most honest men in the territory. But their happiness was not without complications. In late September, a man named Victor Blackwood rode into Stillwater. Blackwood was a wealthy rancher from Wyoming, a man in his late 40s with silver hair and cold blue eyes. He owned thousands of acres and hundreds of head of cattle, and he was known for being ruthless in business. He walked into the general store one afternoon while Cassandra was working alone, and he studied her with an appraising gaze that made her skin crawl. "You must be the young lady I have heard so much about," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Miss Montgomery, is it?" The mail-order bride who never made it to the altar. Cassandra forced herself to smile politely. "Yes, sir. How may I help you today?" "I need supplies for my men," he said, handing her a long list. "But more than that, I wanted to meet you. I've been looking for a wife, someone refined and educated who could manage a household befitting my station. You seem like exactly the kind of woman I need." Cassandra felt a chill run down her spine. "That is very flattering, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm not looking for a husband at the moment." His smile did not reach his eyes. "I am a patient man, Miss Montgomery. I can wait. But you should know that I always get what I want eventually." He paid for his supplies and left, but Cassandra could not shake the feeling of unease that lingered long after he was gone. When James came by later that afternoon, she told him about the encounter, and his expression darkened. "Stay away from Blackwood," he said, his voice tight with anger. "He is a dangerous man. I have heard stories about how he treats the people who work for him, and about the ranchers he has forced off their land. If he has set his sights on you, we need to be careful." Cassandra felt a flicker of fear, but also a strange sense of determination. "I am not afraid of him," she said, "and I'm not interested in becoming his wife. I have made my choice, James." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I will not let him hurt you," he promised. "I swear it." But Blackwood was not a man who gave up easily. Over the next few weeks, he made it clear that he intended to court Cassandra, sending expensive gifts to the store that she refused to accept, and showing up at church on Sundays to sit in the pew behind her, his presence a constant oppressive weight. He spoke to the owner of the general store, offering to buy the building and suggesting that Cassandra would be better off working for him. He even approached Samuel Reed, offering to buy James's contract and send him to a ranch in Colorado, far away from Stillwater. Samuel refused, of course, but the message was clear. Blackwood would use any means necessary to get what he wanted. James was beside himself with worry and rage. He wanted to confront Blackwood directly, to tell him to leave Cassandra alone, but Samuel talked him down, reminding him that Blackwood had money and influence, and that a confrontation could end very badly for James. Instead, Samuel suggested a different approach. "Marry her," Samuel said bluntly. "If she is your wife, Blackwood will have no claim on her. He might still cause trouble, but at least she will be legally protected." James had been thinking the same thing, but he had hesitated, worried that Cassandra would think he was rushing her, that she would feel pressured. But now, with Blackwood circling like a predator, he knew Samuel was right. He had to act. He found Cassandra in the meadow, where they had shared their first kiss. She had started going there on her afternoons off, finding peace in the wildflowers and the sound of the creek. When she saw him riding up, she smiled, but her smile faded when she saw the serious expression on his face. "What is wrong?" she asked, rising to her feet. James dismounted and walked to her, taking her hands in his. "Cassandra, I know we have not known each other long, but I need you to hear me out. I am in love with you. I think I have been since the night of the meteor shower, when I saw you standing under the stars and wished that somehow you could be mine. And now, with Blackwood trying to force his way into your life, I cannot stand by and do nothing. Marry me, not because you are scared or because you need protection, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Marry me and let me be the man who gets to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. Please." Cassandra's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment James's heart sank, thinking she was going to say no. But then she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him fiercely, and when she pulled back, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you too. I think I have loved you since you sat down next to me in church that first Sunday. You are everything I wished for, everything I never thought I would find. Yes, I will marry you." James let out a whoop of joy and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he finally set her down, he kissed her again, pouring all of his love and relief and hope into that kiss, and she kissed him back with equal passion. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church where they had first sat together. Cassandra wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself with wildflowers in her hair, and James wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. The whole town turned out for the wedding, and even Samuel Reed, who was not known for being sentimental, had tears in his eyes as he watched them exchange their vows. Victor Blackwood did not attend, but his absence was a relief rather than a disappointment. He left Stillwater the day after the wedding, and while there were rumors that he had made threats about ruining James, nothing ever came of it. Some said that Samuel Reed had pulled some strings with people he knew in the territorial government, making it clear that Blackwood would face serious consequences if he caused trouble. Others said that Blackwood had simply moved on to easier prey. Either way, he never bothered them again. James and Cassandra moved into a small cabin on the edge of the Triple R Ranch, a place that Samuel had offered them at a reduced rent. It was modest, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Cassandra made it into a home with curtains she sewed from flour sacks, wildflowers in jars on the table, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. James would come home from long days of work to find her waiting for him, and the sight of her smile was enough to wash away every ache and pain. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight, and there were times when they went to bed hungry, saving what little they had for necessities. The Montana winters were brutal, with snow piling up past the windows and temperatures so cold that the water in the basin would freeze overnight. But they faced every hardship together, and somehow that made it bearable. James would hold Cassandra close on the coldest nights, their breath fogging in the air, and whisper promises about the future, about the ranch they would own someday, about the children they would have, about growing old together. Cassandra, for her part, had never been happier. She had left Boston looking for adventure and independence, but what she had found was so much more. She had found love, real and deep and abiding. She had found a partner who valued her opinions, who made her laugh, who held her when she cried and celebrated her successes as though they were his own. She had found a home, not in a place, but in a person. In the spring of 1884, Cassandra discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set over the mountains. He had been whittling a piece of wood, working on a toy horse for the son of one of the other ranch hands, when she reached over and stilled his hands with her own. "James," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up at her, concern flickering across his face. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said, her eyes shining. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, James just stared at her, as though he could not quite process what she had said. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a shout of pure joy. He scooped her up in his arms, careful despite his excitement, and spun her around gently before setting her down and kissing her so thoroughly that they were both breathless. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby. Cassandra, you have just made me the happiest man alive." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about names and cradles and all the ways their lives were about to change. James's hands kept drifting to her still flat stomach, as though he could not quite believe there was a tiny life growing there. Cassandra watched him with a heart so full of love she thought it might burst. Their son was born in December of 1884, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after the man who had given them both a chance when they needed it most. And from the moment James held his son for the first time, Cassandra knew that their little family was complete. Samuel Reed, for whom the baby was named, became a doting honorary grandfather, often stopping by the cabin with small gifts or offering to watch the baby so James and Cassandra could have an evening to themselves. He told anyone who would listen that young Samuel was the finest baby in all of Montana Territory, and no one dared to disagree. As the years passed, James saved every penny he could, still dreaming of owning his own ranch. Cassandra helped by taking in sewing and laundry, and slowly, painfully slowly, their savings grew. When little Samuel was 3 years old, a neighboring rancher decided to sell a parcel of his land, 160 acres with good grazing and a creek running through it. James and Cassandra pooled every cent they had, borrowed a little from Samuel Reed, and bought the land. It was the proudest day of James's life, standing on his own property, holding his son in his arms, with his wife by his side. They built a small house, nothing fancy but sturdy and warm, and they started their herd with a dozen head of cattle and 2 horses. It was hard work, harder than anything they had done before, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Their ranch grew slowly but steadily. James's reputation as an honest man and a skilled horseman brought him business, and Cassandra's careful management of their finances kept them afloat even in lean years. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Clara, born in 1888, and another son, Henry, born in 1891. Their home was filled with laughter and love, with the sound of children playing and the smell of Cassandra's cooking. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, James and Cassandra would sit on the porch of their house, holding hands and watching the stars. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they would see a shooting star streak across the sky, and they would smile at each other, remembering the night of the meteor shower all those years ago. "I made a wish that night," James told her once, many years into their marriage. "I wished for you. I wished that somehow you would be mine." And it came true. Cassandra leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "I made a wish too," she said. "I wished for love, for a second chance, for someone who would see me and choose me. And you are the answer to every wish I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night sky. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together out of hope and hard work and an unwavering belief in each other. The meteor shower had brought them together, but it was their love that had made them last. As the years turned into decades, James and Cassandra's ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. Their children grew up strong and capable, and eventually all 3 of them chose to stay and help run the family business. Samuel married a school teacher from town, Clara married a rancher from the next county over, and Henry, the youngest, took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, allowing James and Cassandra to finally slow down and enjoy their later years. They had grandchildren, more than a dozen of them, and their house was always full of noise and activity. James taught his grandsons to ride and rope, just as he had taught his own sons, and Cassandra taught her granddaughters to sew and bake, passing down the skills that had helped her survive when she first arrived in Montana all those years ago. But no matter how busy their lives became, James and Cassandra always made time for each other. They still walked down to the creek on warm summer afternoons, still sat on the porch in the evenings holding hands, still kissed each other goodnight as though they were newlyweds. Their love had not dimmed with time. If anything, it had grown deeper, richer, tempered by the challenges they had faced and the life they had built together. One August evening in 1912, 30 years to the day after the meteor shower that had brought them together, James surprised Cassandra by hitching up a wagon and driving her out to the meadow where they had shared their first kiss. The wildflowers were still blooming, though they were both much older now, with silver in their hair and lines on their faces earned through years of laughter and hard work. They spread out a blanket just as they had all those years ago, and James unpacked a basket with bread and cheese and apples, the same simple meal they had shared on their first picnic. As the sun set and the stars began to appear, they lay back on the blanket, their fingers intertwined, watching the sky. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked quietly. "Choosing me, I mean. You could have gone back to Boston, married someone with money and an easy life." Cassandra turned to look at him, her eyes soft with love. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, James. You gave me adventure and independence, and a love that has sustained me through everything. I would choose you 1,000 times over in every lifetime." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Cassandra Dalton. I loved you the moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," she whispered. As if on cue, a shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and beautiful, and they both watched it in silence. This time neither of them made a wish. They did not need to. Everything they had ever wanted was right there, lying on a blanket in a meadow, hands clasped together, under the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their love story 30 years before. James and Cassandra lived to see Montana become a state, to see automobiles replace horses on the roads, to see the world change in ways they could never have imagined when they first met. But through it all, their love remained constant, a steady flame that never wavered, never dimmed. James passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1920 at the age of 64, with Cassandra holding his hand. She grieved him deeply, as any woman would grieve the loss of the love of her life. But she did not regret a single moment they had shared. He had given her 38 years of happiness, of partnership, of a love so deep and true that it had changed the course of her entire life. Cassandra lived for another 10 years after James's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who had wished for her under a meteor shower and spent the rest of his life making that wish come true. She told them about the meadow and the creek, about the first kiss and the first dance, about all the little moments that had made up their life together. When Cassandra passed away in her sleep in the summer of 1930, at the age of 71, her family buried her next to James on a hill overlooking their ranch. They placed a single headstone for both of them, with an inscription that read, "James and Cassandra Dalton, two souls who wished upon the stars and found each other, together forever." And on clear summer nights, when the sky is full of stars and the world is quiet, people say you can still feel their love in that meadow by the creek, in the wildflowers that bloom every year, in the gentle breeze that whispers through the cottonwood trees, because some loves are so strong, so true, that they transcend time and space and even death itself. James and Cassandra's love was one of those loves, a testament to the power of hope, of wishing on stars, and of believing that sometimes, against all odds, miracles really do come true.